Hello, learners, and welcome to the 38th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. As promised, I will wrap up our discussion of Iris Murdoch in this lecture. I have been describing the possible dialogues between professional philosophy and how these ideas, or even more particularly speaking, how the styles of thought and modes of perception that the discipline of academic philosophy teaches us, and how these styles of thought were best known to one of the most proficient and expert practitioners of that academic philosophy, might be translated and might become the shaping influence for compelling fiction, right? So the goal of reading novels is not to sort of reverse engineer from the novel to what the author's education or background was. Ultimately, the test of a novel is whether or not it can engage us, whether or not it can provide us intellectual and emotional stimulation, irrespective of the author's or the reader's academic backgrounds. So the point of understanding Iris Murdoch's academic background is not to justify the novels, but to see where these forms of thinking and writing came from and what is the author trying to do if, in some cases, we do not find the finished product to be as compelling as we might have expected. So I'll just briefly mention a few things and then take a brief detour into a theoretical and literary historical concept, that of fictionality, because I find that to be very, very useful. And actually, I thought about it as I was preparing for and giving the lecture immediately before this one. The lecture in which I described this dialogue between the particularizing impulse and the abstracting impulse, both of which play an equally important role, and both of which need to be in some sort of a dialogue for fiction to work. I find that this tension between the particularizing and abstracting impulses is important to understand. And without understanding that, we cannot really understand novels or literature as a whole. And it just so happens that a very senior scholar and a very important scholar has reflected on this and has published about it. And I will briefly refer to that scholarly source. This is the essay and later the book chapter, which is On the Rise of Fictionality by the scholar of Victorian literature, Catherine Gallagher. So I'll do that, but before that, I want to give some brief information and a few details pertaining to Iris Murdoch's life and career. So I mentioned that several of Murdoch's colleagues were dabbling in, and dabbling may not be the best word, but it is the best word that I can think of at this point. Several of Murdoch's colleagues dabbled in this form, the genre of the detective novel, and it might have appeared to be a somewhat trivial or popular form, but only because outwardly the form was quite different from the kind of lives and the kind of writing that these philosophy professors practiced. But if one thinks about it, the form of the detective novel is intellectually quite complex. It is not easy to design, outline, and write a detective novel, a good one in any case. And so, if one really pays attention to it, there's actually not that much difference. Nonetheless, appearances matter. And for several philosophy professors, it was not something that they wanted to advertise. And so there's this example of J.I.M. Stewart, who in the 1950s and 60s was an English professor at Christ Church College, Oxford, and who wrote detective fiction as Michael Innes. And so there were several writers, and Colin Burrow has this expression that colleagues of Murdoch who practice detective fiction under pseudonyms may be described as writing novels by Iris Murdoch without the metaphysics. So this is another way of understanding what Iris Murdoch achieved and how she achieved that in her fictional oeuvre. One can say, and I find this to be persuasive, borrowing from Colin Burrow, is that Iris Murdoch took the forensic realism of detective fiction and the settings of detective fiction. So, detective fiction usually has a very fixed setting. It concerns a large common space, like a big house, sometimes a big ship, and it's a space in which a lot of different individuals are confined through some reason. And this can be seen in most of Agatha Christie's novels, which concern large English houses. It can also be seen in the creative output of a contemporary writer and creative mind who I believe, and this is my opinion, but I think we can argue about it, who I believe is attaining the kind of respect and appreciation and popularity as well as critical acclaim for the 21st century in the way, in almost the same way as Agatha Christie had begun to enjoy respect and acclaim and popularity in the 20th century. And that writer is the screenwriter and film director and producer Rian Johnson. Many of you will probably know through the Knives Out franchise. And at the time of recording this lecture, it's the late December of 2025, and it's become a sort of a biannual tradition. Every couple of years, Ryan Johnson releases a Knives Out movie, and the intellectual labor of writing, scripting, designing these films, it's easy to dismiss them as cozy crime. And as cozy crime, they are very good, but they also demonstrate a very high degree of intellectual work. And I just want to take a moment to point out the affinities between detective fiction and several very modern epistemological traditions. Detective fiction relies, or at least the assumption on which detective fiction relies, and without which detective fiction would not work, is a bedrock of modern science. Scientific ideas govern modern life, and this is the assumption on which detective fiction works. The earliest detective fiction featured scientists and lawyers as detectives. They were able to piece together evidence and catch these criminals because the physical world carried traces, carried the evidence of actions which individual human beings tried to obliterate or erase. So, for instance, it was a lawyer and a scientist, and also in some Victorian novels, the expert navigator of train schedules, railway schedules, who happened to piece together the travels of multiple individuals in order to arrive at circumstantial evidence and finally scientific evidence also. So, detective fiction has always been very deeply reliant on new and emergent epistemic paradigms. So, new forms of knowledge, new languages of knowing, as well as new ideas of evidence, new kinds of evidence, and new paradigms for interpreting evidence. These are the intellectual bedrocks of detective fiction. And so it's not surprising at all that professors at elite universities like Oxford, who are engaged in studying epistemology and questioning and broadening the horizons of existing epistemic paradigms, it's not surprising that individuals whose professional lives consists of examining forms of knowing, that is, professors of philosophy and literature at Oxford, would feel inclined to have a little light-hearted, fun experimentation in which they would implement or test some of their more radical ideas in a fictional world. So, this is another example in which the act of writing a novel, creating a fictional world, becomes a little bit like conducting an experiment in a laboratory. And I think I mentioned Bruno Latour in one of my earlier lectures. That idea is very, very pertinent. Bruno Latour discusses this idea of literature and especially novels as being thought experiments. So, just like a scientific laboratory allows a scientist to conduct a physical experiment, the fictional world of a novel allows a writer to conduct a thought experiment. Now, a thought experiment is not meant to reduce the value of the experiment from an actual experiment. It is still every bit as radical and as important as an actual experiment. So, Iris Murdoch's novels may be read as very powerful thought experiments investigating the nature of relationships. So, one more thing, the kinds of philosophical traditions that Iris Murdoch drew on. So, in 1953, Iris Murdoch wrote one of the earliest English language discussions of Sartre's philosophy. So, Jean Paul Sartre, who's very well known as an existentialist philosopher, Sartre's thoughts on freedom, as discussed in Being and Nothingness, ultimately gave forward a very cynical, somewhat restricted idea of human freedom. And it is this idea of human freedom, with its limitations, that Iris Murdoch continued to explore and investigate in much of her career. And it is this idea of the limitations of human freedom or the illusions of human freedom that one can find in the bumbling set of mismatched romantic partners in A Severed Head. Now, one more idea before I move on from Iris Murdoch. This is an idea from Colin Burrow again. And Colin Burrow describes Iris Murdoch's fictional oeuvre as a sort of rebellion against a particular idea of describing human relationships that had been deeply ingrained in the English novel at the time that Iris Murdoch inherited that tradition and began contributing to it. What is that idea? That idea, as Burrow describes it, is this very bourgeois notion of love, marriage, or relationships. What is that bourgeois nature? It's important to take a few minutes to try and understand that. The word bourgeois is very important. It comes from political theory, and I think the origin of the word is the German word for landowner or shop owner, and it comes from the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. But essentially, in common usage, bourgeois refers to middle class, someone who doesn't have to earn their living by the labor of their bodies. And this means physical labor, someone who has shops or businesses or basically capital, someone who earns money by putting their money to work. Bourgeois is different from the traditional landowner and also different from the new idea of the worker. Now, bourgeois is a very important word that's used in the context of the literary history of the English novel. In one of my earliest lectures, I referred to Franco Moretti's book, The Bourgeois. And Franco Moretti, as a Marxist-inspired literature scholar and literary historian, is very appropriately, very deeply entrenched in that Marxist history, in the economic and social history of England, in which Franco Moretti situates the origin of the English novel. So for Franco Moretti, writers like Daniel Defoe are central to the formation of the English novel because they were businessmen. They were part of this very newly emerging class in 18th century England, the class of business owners who had surplus income and who catered to other individuals who were beginning to have surplus income and leisure time. So the book writing and the book buying public in England was central to the rise of the English novel, and they were all part of this bourgeois class. So historically, the bourgeois class is very, very important for the rise of the English novel. Whatever the bourgeois class's reputation may be in a Marxian and economic history of Europe, this class, the bourgeois, was central to the foundation, rise, popularity, and growth of the English novel. For Burrow, when Burrow writes that Murdoch was rebelling against a bourgeois notion of desire or love, what does that mean specifically? What that means is that certain conceptions of the meaning of marriage, certain conceptions of the meanings of relationships were central to upholding bourgeois notions of wealth. So it was important to define marriage in a particular way so as to ensure that property would be retained and transferred and inherited in a particular way. This is a definition of an extremely cynical definition, I must say, but nonetheless a very, very influential definition of marriage, family, and kinship that is put forward in the text, The Origins of the Family by Friedrich Engels. Now, in this idea, heterosexual marriages or things like courtship, things like fidelity, things like the legal contracts of marriage, all of these things in this Marxian reading is interpreted as being instituted with one goal, the goal of ensuring that certain individuals retain the ownership of a particular commodity, that is property. Now, if one were to dismantle this notion of monogamous, heterosexual, legally ordained notion of marriage, all of the underlying assumptions about economics and the way property was owned and transferred, those would also crumble. So, this is what Colin Burrow means when he says that there is a way of describing relationships and marriages in the English novel which is very bourgeois. And Iris Murdoch, as a novelist, questions those. So, what specifically does Murdoch question? The monogamy, the notion that individuals decide to stay with one other person for the rest of their lives and not stray from them. These are all notions that, from Iris Murdoch's perspective, that of an educated philosopher, a person who examines life, a person who asks powerful, radical questions about the choices one makes and does not merely accept conventions simply because other people believe them or because society has practiced them before our time. So, as a philosopher who examines life instead of merely accepting or repeating the conventions set by other people, Iris Murdoch was bound to question things like monogamy, compulsory heterosexuality, etc., etc. It was not from a desire to overturn or subvert society, from natural desire to understand and to make an informed decision about things like who does one allow oneself to be attracted to, for instance. So, against this, what do we find in Iris Murdoch's fiction? What we find in Iris Murdoch's fiction is a willingness to question these arbitrary conventions. This is as regards the kind of things that Murdoch writes about, the kind of events that unfold in the fiction. But there's also an important distinction, not just in what Murdoch's novels describe, but in the manner in which Murdoch's novels describe those things. The manner in which Murdoch's novels describe those things inspires Colin Burrow to use the expression that Murdoch is an anti-novelist. And I'll read that expression. I'll read a bit of that passage from Colin Burrow. Murdoch is in some respects an anti-novelist in that she's not very good at particularizing people unless they happen to be very wicked, in which case they tend just to become embodiments of power. Or, to put that another way, she's in a very precise sense a promiscuous author for whom individuals are over interchangeable. And as a result, they seem sometimes to be not quite there or are there while you read and then vanish the moment you put the book down. So this is, in some ways, Colin Burrow is clearing a space in the historical narrative of the evolution of the English novel and making a somewhat backhanded compliment, but also in some ways, and I'm inclined to read this comment in an optimistic way, in a sympathetic way, which is to say that Iris Murdoch took greater risks than other writers and was able to write novels from a perspective which was quite unique and quite powerful. It was unique and powerful because it proceeded from assumptions which were quite opposite to that of the assumptions of the conventional novelist. And this is what Burrow means, that when he writes that Murdoch was an anti-novelist and does not particularize. This tension between the particularizing and the universalizing principles is something that the scholar and the professor Catherine Gallagher has described, as I mentioned in her essay on fictionality. And Gallagher has reflected on this in a much more sustained, serious, and rigorous manner. And so I hope I'll get some time to talk about that eventually. But right now, I just want to say that it's possible to understand the place that Iris Murdoch occupies in 20th century English fiction by referring to this strange combination of philosophical insight as well as formal technique. So, the formal technique which makes Iris Murdoch different is that Murdoch does not merely particularize or universalize, but always questions different possible combinations of these two impulses. So, this is what makes the manner of observations in Iris Murdoch's novels quite unique and earns Murdoch a place in the history of the 20th century English novel. And this by itself is further complicated by the fact that this observational technique is itself employed for the exploration of philosophical ideas. What were these philosophical ideas? I'll read once more from Burrow to summarize this and also to summarize what we can take to be the justification for Iris Murdoch's place in 20th century English fiction. Murdoch combined an implausibly unconstrained conception of human freedom, ultimately drawn from Sartre, with an implausibly depersonalizing view of love drawn from Plato. Fusing these two things. So, philosophically, Murdoch's training reflects these two very, very unique and insightful positions. So, not simply repeating what Sartre said, because as we know, Sartre was himself a philosopher novelist. So, it's not that Murdoch simply repeated Sartre's philosophical ideas in fiction, and neither did Murdoch simply replace Plato's ideas, but rather it was a unique combination of these two, and the unconstrained conception of freedom with the depersonalizing view of love. So one is an extremely personal idea, and the other is an extremely abstract and universal idea. That in Plato's view, we are all living in a cave, and real things are happening outside it. So we are simply playing with like a fake version of the real forces that are shaping our world. So these two things are combined. And then in addition to this, these two philosophical modes of thinking, Murdoch also takes on the conventions of two important realistic novel traditions. First, as I mentioned, is the detective novel, and the second is that of the romance novel with some dialogue with the novel of manners. So these combinations of philosophical insights as well as formal techniques make Iris Murdoch a very, very unique, unprecedented, and singular novelist of the 20th century. Now, to briefly flag ideas of fictionality before I wrap up this lecture and talk more about fictionality in the next one. So, for Catherine Gallagher, fictionality is an important historical and conceptual development of the 18th century. In some ways, Gallagher is working in the intellectual tradition established by Ian Watt in his, I think, 1956 book, The Rise of the Novel. The accurate information will be on the screen. But essentially, Gallagher is not satisfied with Ian Watt's claim that the novel is a new literary genre because of the way it deploys formal realism. And for Gallagher, formal realism is good enough. Formal realism is accurate. Formal realism describes what we find in the novels of Henry Fielding and Daniel Defoe and Samuel Richardson, but that's not good enough. Rather, what was formal realism itself coming from? What was the intellectual tradition and system that was changing, that was itself giving way to new modes of thinking? So, what was the intellectual change that was occurring in 18th century England, which made possible the very imagination and the writing of things like the novel? This is the larger intellectual goal that Catherine Gallagher is chasing, and Gallagher's opening claim is that fictionality is that important idea. Fictionality is important because for the first time in the history of Western civilization, it became possible for writers to make imaginative claims, but actually they were not just imaginative, they were also epistemic, moral, intellectual, and in every sense of the word, serious claims. For the first time in the history of Western civilization, it became possible to make the most serious kind of intellectual claim while talking about people and events that were very, very clearly not true. So, this combination of epistemic seriousness while talking about things that were decidedly not true is something that Gallagher takes a lot of pains to clarify and to explain. And this is essentially what we take for granted today when we pick up and read a novel. We know that the people we are reading about are not real. They are the figment of someone's imagination. But at the same time, we also know that what we are reading about is not a lie. It's to be taken seriously. But the kind of seriousness that we reserve for reading a novel occupies a different category. It's as if we have learned to create a new room inside the mansions or the houses of our minds. Traditionally, there were only two kinds of rooms if we take the metaphor of our mind as a house. There's one room which is reserved only for verifiable scientific facts, and the other room is reserved for purely fictional or imaginative things. But early in the 18th century, and the time period that Gallagher is concerned with is 1720 to 1740, a new room began to be built in the collective minds of readers of novels. This room was called the room of fictionality. It was a room in which we could read characters, we could read about individuals who did not have any real referent or counterparts in the physical world in which we lived. However, despite not having physical reference, and in some cases because they did not have physical reference, these fictional characters had sometimes even stronger claims on our intellectual lives than individuals or writings which described real individuals like newspaper reports or historical narratives. I'll stop here and reflect in a slightly more detailed manner on this idea of fictionality in the next lecture, while also continuing with the next novelist in our series, which is Bessie Head, the author of the novel A Question of Power, in the next lecture. Thanks.